let Rana take over with the presentation. So we're live on YouTube. Excellent. So I'd like to welcome everyone to this report launch event for the Renewables in Cities Global Status Report by REC2021. Today, we are going to have a first discussion of the report by Rana Adib, the Executive Director of REC2021, followed by a Q&A with the report authors. So Leah Rinalder of REC2021 will be moderating this discussion. Your questions will be answered by the report authors. And then for the last 15 minutes of the event, we're going to ask you to go into breakout rooms and dive deep into these discussions. We'll have a breakout room on policies, buildings, transport, investment, citizen participation, and cities in sub-Saharan Africa. And we'll give you more information about those breakout rooms a little bit later. For now, we ask that you keep your camera and microphone off. And during the breakout rooms, we would like you to keep those on so that you can engage in the discussion. At this stage, I'd like to pass the microphone over to Rana Adib, the Executive Director of REC2021.
Thank you very much, Tammy. Can everybody see me? Yes. Hello, everybody. Welcome. I'm really extremely excited that we're launching the second edition of the Renewables in Cities Global Status Report, and that we have so much interest also. And we clearly see that this has been also, I guess, like, this might be a positive part of COVID, that cities are getting more and more interested in renewable energy. And that's clearly something we see in the discussions around the report launch. So let me share my screen with you. And I would like to ask the team to confirm that you can see my screen and the right presentation. Thank you. So renewables now, I mean, I would imagine that many of you know who we are, but to start with, I think it's important to just recall who we are. So we're the only global community of players from renewable energy actors, from science, academia, NGOs, governments, and industry. And I really underline this because it's a diversity of perspectives. It's a community. There is a collaborative spirit. There is 2,000 community members. And this really allows us to tap into decentralized intelligence of these players. So the Renewables in Cities Global States Report 2021 is really a collaborative effort of more than 350 experts worldwide. And what is this report? It is clearly the only stock taking of cities' energy transition efforts worldwide. So we're looking into the trends and policies and markets and investment, but also in community energy. And since we realize that it's not only about data and facts, but that it's also about how cities implement, about the stories around it, and about bringing renewable energy in the broader societal context, we clearly also have like some case studies included in the report and that are being showcased. Now, why do we look into cities in the renewable energy transition context? One aspect is clearly that cities are high impact areas. What does high impact areas mean? So we have 55% of the global population that lives in cities. So considering the fact that citizens really also have a large pressure on governments to move forward, that is something which is important. But also cities account for 3/4 of the global final energy use and 75% of global energy-related CO2 emissions. So very clearly, bringing efficiency and renewable energy into the city space is allowing us to reach the global objectives of decarbonization. Another aspect in the city environment space is clearly also that it's not only about the emitting part, but the reality is that cities are highly vulnerable to climate change impacts. 90% of the worldwide urban areas are at coastal lines. So that's one aspect, cities as high impact areas. The other aspect, however, and you have heard it many, many times from REC2021 side, but we cannot underline this enough. Energy is more than power. And renewable energy is happening in the power sector mainly in an accelerated way. But over 80% of the energy consumption is happening in heating and cooling, so in buildings and industry and in transport. And here we only have a share of 10%, respectively 3.3% of renewable energy. And this clearly means that we need to accelerate the uptake here if we're really serious about climate change targets. Cities have a key role to play here because it's about buildings, it's about road transportation, etc. Now, another aspect cities bring, and I think that is really important, cities do not always see themselves as key players in the energy transition. Their drivers for renewable energy are linked to clean air and a healthy environment, and this has clearly been accentuated in 2020. Climate change mitigation and adaptation, local economic development. So when we're thinking about, let's say, the building sector or also the electrification of fleets and the distribution infrastructure required, this creates local jobs. So it's really something which is very important at the city level. Stable and secure energy supply. In developing countries, the question of energy access. And then very clearly operational costs. So reducing expenses and managing costs is something which is very important, and energy costs in cities represent a big part. Clearly, and I think climate, so Friday for Future, for instance, has shown developments in Chile. Even though citizens' developments happen everywhere, they are accentuated in a different way in the city space. And so energy justice and democracy is at the forefront of cities' agendas. Now, the reality is that all this discussion allows us to also position renewable energy in a broader way. And when it comes down to mainstreaming renewable energy, it means increasing the policy attention, market acceptance, and citizens' acceptance. So it's very important to also see how renewable energy plays a role in the broader context. What we do see is that cities globally commit to renewables and net zero. The good news is over 1,300 cities have a renewable energy target and or a policy. The better news is that this represents 1 billion people worldwide living in cities with renewable energy targets and policies, approximately 25% of the urban population. So it's very clear that cities recognize renewables as an opportunity. We see, however, that they do not only support renewable energy directly, but echoing basically the driver's part, they will also have other entry points, whether it is the emissions, whether it is air pollution, whether it is transfer pressure in terms of congestions. And as a result, we have other targets and commitments and actions which are supporting renewable energy, like net zero commitments, electric vehicle targets, but clearly also the divestment of fossil fuels and even fossil fuel bans. So there's an increasing amount of cities recognizing that we need to leave the fossil fuel era to move into an efficient and renewable energy era. Another aspect very clearly is that many cities and an increasing amount of cities in 2020 has also declared climate emergency. And this clearly shows the link also to citizens' movement with regard to that. So cities recognize the opportunity. 1,300 cities have renewable energy targets. And I invite you to go to the report to look into the details. I'm not going to run you through this, but just show you some meta information, I guess. One thing to probably underline, or which I would like to underline in the case, for instance, just using the case of Seoul, but there are many others. Cities are quite innovative to also engage in the renewable energy transition, even though they are in a space constrained environment. It's very clear that they need enabling frameworks for this, but the example of Seoul shows clearly that it is possible in a different way. Seoul had a couple of years ago decided to replace one full nuclear plant by PV, solar PV, integrated into the city space. And Seoul, together with many other Korean cities, have clearly put a pressure on the national government to be more ambitious when it comes to their climate commitments and the decarbonization target. So more than 830 cities in 72 countries had renewable energy targets. What we see here is that often they might be even more ambitious than the targets which are set at the national level. So the targets might be earlier, there might be higher shares, and we have even many cities also having 100% renewable energy targets. We clearly see that there is a big push in North America and Europe. When we're looking, however, and I mean, there is also renewable energy targets in other regions, but what is really interesting is when we are looking at city level net zero targets, they have increased 8-fold in 2020. So around 800 cities in 63 countries had net zero targets. And Latin America and Asia are quite prominent here. This clearly explains that the renewable energy discussion is not the main entry point very often here, but it's often about air pollution and about congestion pressure. And the case of Latin America, for instance, show that in many Latin American countries, there is high shares of renewable energy in the grid because there is a lot of hydropower. And as a result, cities do not always see the necessity to set a separate renewable energy target. I just underline one thing, sorry, I'm stepping back. The reality is that from these net zero targets, there are, however, 222 cities that also had renewable energy commitments. What is clear is this is certainly an awareness raising which is required to add basically more specific renewable targets as a complement. Now, the reality is that targets are not enough. We need policies and implementation. And a first step which we have observed in the research is very clearly that cities are leading by example because they are moving to renewable energy for their own operations. Clearly on the renewable electricity side with procurement, but also innovative ways of doing this with strategic partnerships of third parties, but also linking this to regions around the city space. On-site renewable energy generation, and clearly also the collaboration with community projects. When we're looking into heat, we see a trend in terms of district energy, for instance, urban transportation and electrification of the public transport fleets, but also the use, for instance, of biomethane from waste treatment plants into the bus fleets. And clearly also an engagement on the energy infrastructure. So it is very clear that cities do drive on their municipal operations renewable energy in all sectors. The reality is, however, that city governments have a role beyond their own operations, and this is creating also, they have a legal power and they can inspire other city actors to engage. And what is very clear that cities are also using their regulatory power to support the deployment of renewable energy. Almost 800 cities had policies that are supporting renewable energy. And we're looking on the right side, you see that there is clearly a focus on power, but also many policies in heating and cooling, power heating and cooling in buildings specifically, and also transport. Just an example from Germany, Heidelberg. What is really interesting here is that cities are using different types of incentives. And here, Heidelberg is using mandates, so obligations, for instance, in new buildings to integrate high shares of solar PV and solar thermal. So there is the obligatory part, but also incentives to have city players really engage and invest in renewable energy. So this is one example. I invite you to dig deeper in the report. And to show that cities really are also pushing the integrated approaches. The case of Malmö really showed that there is an integration in all sectors. So that is clearly a trend we see, that cities that are extremely advanced in their engagement on renewable energy will think renewable energy everywhere. It's not only about the municipal operations, but it's about how to really build renewable energy into the sectors. Malmö is, for instance, working on waste to energy, is working on biofuel parts, getting the waste from the region and linking this back into the fleets, but also working clearly on heating in the building sector, etc. So I think this is an example which really shows that cities can be a very significant integrator to bridge basically between the sectors. And another aspect, which I think is really interesting, is that there is an increasing amount of cities that understands, it's still a very small amount of cities, but increasing, but that understand that it's not only about moving to renewable energy, but that they also need to basically ban fossil fuels. Just two aspects to underline here. California and European cities are in the lead here. California, with fossil fuel bans and restrictions in buildings and cities, has been leading Californian cities. And when we are looking into European cities, we have really quite a high number of cities with low emission zones and vehicle bans on certain technologies. So there is an increasing understanding that it's about moving out of one system and into another one. Obviously, there are barriers to city action, and I think you will see them throughout the report. One barrier, which is a general one, is that there is a lacking awareness. There is still a lacking awareness on the fact that renewables is an urban opportunity. This comes from the fact that historically energy supply has been very much driven at the national government level. And cities do not always recognize the active role they have to play and they can play. They have a responsibility, but they really have a huge potential. The other aspect is also that national governments may actually not consider the role of cities and how cities can help national governments to reach their own targets. The other aspect is clearly a lacking legislative power, which was a main barrier, and especially in some regions. And this explains, for instance, why in the US and Europe, we do see high engagement here, because the cities do have quite a positive or rather a developed legislative power to some other regions. And then clearly, when we're looking into smaller cities, in particular middle-sized cities, the access to resources. This can be expertise, it can be capacity constraints at the city government level. But another aspect, and very important one, is really the lacking financial resources and access to financial markets, which is a main barrier. And I think that Kristen is going to explain this a bit more in one of the breakout rooms. And then the reality is that cities are actually no isolated space. So they are impacting the environment, but they are also being impacted by national and regional policy and regulative frameworks and priorities. So market rules and energy regulations set at the national and state provincial level clearly have an influence on what cities can do. And I just take the example of national level subsidies for fossil fuel. These clearly undermine city action when we're looking in particular into the heating sector and in the transport sector, because these sectors are highly dependent on fossil fuel. And very clearly the fossil fuel subsidies distort the market conditions. Another aspect which we have seen, and I think that REC2021 is really starting to build up more evidence here, is that there is lacking data actually on what is really happening on renewable energy in cities. And this data is actually really important to inform decision makers at the policy level, but also decision makers at the city level, investors, etc. And for developing master plans for the implementation. And then obviously for illustrating and tracking the progress. So empowering cities is really important to build their strengths. So we see leading cities are really contributing significantly to what is happening at the national level and contributing to meeting the national targets. But the reality is that they need to be empowered to do so. And I would just like to finish on one example, which I really find very interesting. Cape Town in South Africa has engaged many years ago in decarbonization strategies and also the role of renewable energy in this context. And over the years, they have developed it as much as they could in the national policy and regulatory framework at the city level, but have basically successfully challenged the national government in court to allow them to become, to first choose where they get the electricity from so that they do not buy coal-based electricity in the national grids, but also become a renewable energy producer. So all this to say, and I think this is really one of the key messages, renewables does present an urban opportunity. This is really something which we see and which is recognized. The reality is that cities need to see this, and that without having the local action, we cannot reach the global goals. And this means that cities need the power to act. that national governments need to recognize the role they play. Cities need to recognize the role they can play. They need to come together at the same table to discuss energy strategies. And what is fundamental is really aligning national and city policies to shift basically renewable energy in all sectors, or to shift to renewable energy in all sectors. And I would like to thank you all for your attention, and also our funders from BMU and the European Commission. Thank you very much. And I think I'm handing over to Leah.
Thank you very much, Rana, for that overview of what we all have been up to in the last, well, 1.5 years almost. I'm Leah, as Rana said. I am enlightened, really happy to be able to lead this Q&A with the authors here today. Rana gave an overview of what we've been up to. There is so much more in this report, so I invite you all to dig deeper. And now is really the chance to ask any questions that you might have to our experts. I've seen the chat already firing up. That is absolutely amazing. So without further ado, let me introduce to you our authors and experts here today with us on the call. We have Kristen Seaborth, we have Henry Bush, we have Flavia Guerra, Duncan Gibb, Toby Couture, and Joel Nana. And really happy that you're here with us today. I've been seeing questions come in. Before I'm handing over the floor to you, I, as the moderator, am going to take the liberty to answer some of these questions because they feel like they're a bit more general, which is there a renewable energy database on all the targets and policies that Rana just mentioned? Yes, absolutely. There is a massive Excel sheet available for download. You can spend hours to dig deeper into all the policies, targets, and mechanisms that exist. So that could definitely fill a couple of weekends. There was a question on if the report touches upon energy efficiency. This is a renewable energy report. We at REC2021 acknowledge that energy efficiency and renewables are twin pillars in order to realize decarbonization and in order to achieve the energy transition. But it is a focus on renewables while acknowledging and also showcasing how some cities are specifically coupling energy efficiency and renewables in order to achieve that goal. With that, let me dig a bit into some of these more questions, and I'll ask some of the questions to you directly, while others are addressed to a bit more everybody here. So feel free to just open up your mic, speak up, and let's have a discussion and disagree if you feel like. Let's make this interesting and interactive if we can. So a first question that has come in is, what role do cities play when it comes to regulating the industry and manufacturing? So really a regulatory role. I think, Toby, that's maybe a question for you right there as our policy experts, but of course also other people, please pipe in, and I'll be quiet now and hand over.
Yeah, that's a challenging question. I think a lot of, first, thank you very much to REC2021. Thank you to everybody who's been part of this. This has really been an unbelievable journey, and it's great to see the final product come together. To try to answer the question, I think the reality is cities often are constrained in the levers that they have at their disposal, and national policy, national rules, national regulations, particularly around things like industrial emissions, are often the dominant source of regulating large industry and manufacturing. So cities can sometimes feel a bit powerless in relation to those. Now, we are seeing, however, some cities starting to ratchet up the pressure and starting to introduce, talking about green industrialization, industrial parks, restricting for local, not only for things like air quality, but a range of other pollutants beyond carbon emissions, to make sure that certain industries are staying within regulatory thresholds, cities can go above and beyond national regulations to try, in many cases, to keep their cities cleaner and to keep air quality concerns in check. But obviously there is a major role for the synergy between local governments and national governments. Cities cannot do this on their own.
Thank you very much, Toby, for that insight. I completely agree. Cities cannot do this on their own. Anybody else that want to chime in on Toby's response here? If not, I would move on to one of the other 20 questions.
I could quickly add something here. I think Toby's answer was, of course, great. A lot of things there. The only thing I would like to add here is, of course, that cities might have the leverage if they are the owner or in control of local power companies. So we see that cities can really drive a renewable agenda to improve living conditions for their citizens in the city if they are in control of basically the companies that do the production of the energy. So just as a leverage point to add. Thanks.
Thank you. I have a quite general question, and I think specifically right now in the current environment, a really, really important question from somebody coming in is, how can we empower cities to go even further and faster now through the various stimulus packages that are being passed with the COVID recovery and that are being announced around the world? What can we do?
Maybe I can jump in. Speaking from the Sub-Saharan African perspective, I think in the report we gave a list of, at the end, towards the end of the chapter, we gave a list of strategies that is applicable to the cities, but it also helps the funders and the international community to know exactly what leverage exists at the municipal level. So I have, I think I'm going to speak to just one. For example, there's internal capacity, which refers to the skills to handle the regulatory environment, the skills to collect the data, to inform the private sector, and so on. So to be able to leverage on this capacity and building the capacity of the cities, I think that would be a great point to start helping the cities to go further in deploying this distributed renewables.
Thank you. Anybody else would like to offer their perspectives of what needs to be done now in the light of the COVID recovery?
Just to add to Joel's point, I mean, I think one of the big, I worry a lot less about some of the leading cities that we profile in the report, like Malmö and Seoul in South Korea and Copenhagen. I think those cities are have the capacity, can finance infrastructure, can mobilize their citizens, can do a lot of things in terms of transport infrastructure that developing country mega cities just can't, or at least can't yet. And I think that's where, to my mind, some of the biggest challenges we have ahead really lie, is how can we take this conversation around some of the leading cities and some of what's happening, although we do feature quite a range, from Uganda, from Togo, from a range of cities around the world in the sub-Saharan African section. I think, to my mind, one of the biggest challenges ahead is how do we get these developing country mega cities on board and really starting to either tap into some of the solutions, some of the ideas that are being developed in other cities around the world. How can we cross-pollinate and sort of share some of these ideas, and how can we also help with the financing piece to get the infrastructure financed and making the financial resources available? And I think the post-COVID recovery packages are a golden opportunity in that regard to try to allocate capital to more sustainable infrastructure, including transport infrastructure, renewable electricity infrastructure, and heating and cooling infrastructure.
Kristen, I saw you were opening. Yes, please go ahead. I saw you were opening that.
It's always hard to know when the time is to jump in on these things. I just wanted to add to Toby's point, because he highlighted, or you highlighted, Toby, the challenge of financing sometimes, particularly for developing countries. And I think one of the biggest problems that we see, at least from the investment perspective, is more than half of countries in the world are not allowed to borrow money by higher level government. So they can't borrow money. They can't, issue municipal bonds. They can't, they're not legally allowed to borrow money to put that infrastructure in place. So that's a huge barrier. And I think until that changes, there is going to be a financial roadblock.
Thank you, Chris.
Yeah.
Was anybody else who wanted to offer something on this question?
I could very, very quickly jump in and say one more thing. I think this is, it also depends very much on which role the big incumbents will have in this. And I see the stimulus packages that are coming up, the green recovery packages that are coming up, as a chance to also break the power of the incumbents. But if we have these big incumbents whose central operation is basically selling fossil energy, then they will make sure that they will keep on doing that, and they have the possibility to keep on doing that. So it's also very much, it's of course an economic question, but it's also very much a political question there. Who has the power to divert the flow of money in these stimulus packages?
Thank you to all of you. Before diving into some more detailed questions, and I really see the chat firing up, which is super exciting, and also discussion going on between all the participants, which is fantastic. That's exactly what we wanted here. I would like to give the opportunity to Duke Allen, one of our steering committee members, who wanted to offer some perspectives from his work. So if you can just turn on your mic and turn on your camera, then we can hear you and you can share some of your insights. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you. Hope everyone can hear me okay. I just wanted to compliment the REC2021 team and all of the contributors on a fantastic report, a very nice complement to the global status report and other reports that come out of REC2021. A couple of points that I would like to share with colleagues across the globe. One is that while the report, I think, highlights the ambitions of cities, which are to be applauded at high scale, I think some of the conversation and some of the points just made about the challenges that cities have to realize these ambitions and goals need to be really addressed quite substantially by all of us. And one of the things that we all can do is to help cities collectively understand the pathways or the roadmap to realizing their ambitious goals. So I know that there are many, many examples, and the colleagues who have contributed to this can highlight many of these. And it's really about I'll call it the tactics, having the implementation plans and the blueprints and the tactics that cities need to follow. One example that I would love to highlight to folks, and I'll put a link to this in the chat, is the work that we've done with the city of Los Angeles. So I know Los Angeles was mentioned and as an exemplary city in the report many times. What's most interesting is the work that we've done with them over the last 3 years to model out every single building, all of the electric vehicle mobility traffic, where those mobility charging stations need to be, and then of course the pathways to 100% renewable energy, which is what their goal is. And this level of detail, while not possible for every city, is certainly possible at some scale for every city. And it gives them real implementation blueprint about how to move forward. So we are thrilled to have worked with the LA Department of Water and Power and the LA Mayor's Office on this and many others. And we welcome sharing that information and the approach with you all and working with you all to bring that class of analysis to cities around the globe. And we really feel as It's a collaborative opportunity to give cities a real jolt, i.e. in American vernacular, the support that they need in more formal language to implement these ambitious goals. So thank you for that opportunity, Leah, and I'll put a link in the chat.
Thanks very much for sharing these insights. It's always fantastic to get some real life examples from the ground of what cities can do and what cities have done. So yes, please share the link. I think we're all excited to learn more about that. I have a lot more questions for you. The first one is, Dre, maybe one for you. There have been many questions now on cities in sub-Saharan Africa and what they've done and what's the action that's happening there. So it'd be fantastic if you can share some of these insights and how cities in sub-Saharan Africa can really also accelerate the uptake to renewables.
Right. I'll just give you a quick snapshot and I invite you to read the report for more information. So the work with cities in sub-Saharan Africa kicked off not so many years ago. It kicked off really recently, around 2014, with a couple of projects and with the CC, Covenant of Mayors in sub-Saharan Africa, which really started in 2017, and the climate action program led by the C40 Cities Network. So with that, they've been able to gather a couple of cities to forge ahead or to rage ahead with the climate action planning. And today, I can't really remember the exact number, but we have a couple of cities that have had like really these very good climate action plans finalized and validated by the international community, in which you can find detailed actions about their roadmaps towards increasing renewable energy deployment in those various cities. So we've highlighted and we've showcased some of those cities in the report. But basically the actions, or in summary, the actions speak to the various sectors, the industrial, commercial, buildings, and so on. But specifically to highlight that sub-Saharan African cities unfortunately don't have much legislative regulatory power, as it's been mentioned earlier. So some of these cities are kind of focusing on the low-hanging fruits, like the municipal buildings, and sometimes even the transport sector where they can influence. But so far the action has been limited, but it didn't stop them at all to develop a long list of actions which they want to lobby the national government to take further. But in a nutshell, that's what I can say. I don't know if there's anything else that needs to be added. Thanks, Leah.
Thanks so much. I think you could probably speak for hours about all the exciting things that are happening in sub-Saharan Africa. But we're actually going to have another webinar next week, where Joel also will be sharing some of his insights. So maybe make sure to drop the link for that webinar also in the chat, in case people really want to learn more and dig deeper into what's happening on the ground there. I do want to, I know we had promised breakout rooms, but I've seen so many exciting questions. So I want to take a couple more minutes to ask these before we go into breakout rooms. And first, these are some sectoral questions. You know, we've been speaking about financial mechanisms, COVID recovery, but Flavia, if you could maybe share some light on what can cities do to increase the share of renewables in transport, and what are some encouraging examples that you've seen from your work, and that might also be inspiring for other cities around the world?
Cool, yeah, thanks for the question. So Rana was very clear on this. So cities can set targets, they can implement policies, but there are limits to how much they can do and how far they can achieve these things. It's encouraging to see that EV targets, for example, so targets for e-mobility are expanding from just the municipal vehicles, so public buses, to citywide targets. So Los Angeles is one of the examples, but we also have London and New York. So these cities have 100% targets for e-mobility by 2050, and they also have targets for high shares of renewable electricity by then. So this is really encouraging. And then whenever they can, we see city governments installing or procuring renewable electricity capacity to power urban trains and metros and trams. This is happening, for example, in Delhi in India, but also across cities in the US and Europe. Although they do have a limited financial power, we see some cities in Austria and in Germany providing incentives and subsidies for electric vehicles and EV charging infrastructure, and requiring that the electricity supplied to that is from renewable sources. In terms of biofuels, it's a little bit tricky because most of the mandates, so biofuel blending mandates, are adopted by national and state level governments, but we have some examples of city governments partnering with private actors to source biofuels to fuel, for example, refuse collection trucks. And then there are many other instruments, which we speak a lot about, the low emission zones, restrictions and bans on diesel vehicles coming up in cities. But it's not only about improving the efficiency of vehicles and shifting to renewable fuels and electricity. It's also about enacting measures such as better urban planning to avoid the need for transport, and then shifting some of the demand to public transport rather than private vehicles. So I'll stop there.
Thanks very much, Flavia. And now just to go to the other side is to ask you, Duncan, our buildings expert, to, what needs to be done and what can cities do to really decarbonize the building stock and to shift to renewables there. And after that, just to say that we promised the breakout rooms, we'll wrap up the discussions, and all the other questions can then be answered by our lovely authors in the breakout rooms. So
sure. Given how we're running a bit late on time, I'll keep my remarks short, but definitely send me an email. You can find my email on our website if you'd like to discuss further. I think it's related to the point that Doug was making about working with Los Angeles, is that cities have a lot of knowledge about what's going on. They're related to their existing building stock and their new building stock, and the measures that will be appropriate for a city depends on this makeup of their buildings. So if we're looking at developed countries or countries like in Europe or in North America, where the building stock is more established and we're expecting fewer new buildings in the future, then it's more about improving renovation rates and trying to increase the share of renewable energy in these buildings by striving to renovate the buildings and to improve the use of heating and cooling systems in these buildings. So the cities targeting higher rates of energy efficiency renovation is obviously a key lever to do this. And then moving on to more of the new building side, cities are able to set revolutionize their building energy codes to ensure that all new buildings that they're constructing are net zero. So we're achieving high levels of energy efficiency in these buildings, but then meeting all existing demand with renewables for electricity and for heat. And this is one of the main levers for them to achieve this as well. So given the time, I think I just wanted to make that point that we have lots of examples in the report of cities that are implementing different types of technology mandates for this, and ways that they're using building zoning to ensure that existing buildings are being retrofitted or new buildings are net zero. And there is a lot of power that cities already have, but there is also a need to create, to let's say, distribute more of this power to cities so they're able to take advantage of their existing, the characteristics of their building stock to make sure that they can achieve their goals.
Thanks very much, Duncan, and thanks to all of you. I think we could just continue this discussion for much longer. I would like to give our participants the chance to really ask their questions directly. So I suggest we move into breakout rooms now. All of you, take your questions, go to the breakout room that you are, associated to the topic that you're most interested in, and then let's have an interactive discussion. It's really also the chance for you to ask questions to the author, but also to exchange best practices, ideas, so we can make this energy transition in cities happening. I'll let Tammy, handing this over to Tammy, who will walk us through how this works.
Thank you so much, Leah. That was a great discussion, and I'm really excited to have everyone in the space jump into these breakout rooms to have this these more in-depth discussions. What I'd like to do now is to show you what's necessary to get you into these breakout rooms. So first of all, some of you already have updated your Zoom, in which case at the bottom of your screen, you should have a breakout room button, and you can choose which breakout room to join. And so you'll be able to jump right in there. If you have a slightly older version of Zoom, we're going to help you get into your breakout room. What you need to do is rename yourself. And in order to rename yourself, you can hover over, if you have a mouse, you'll hover over your block of video, and there should be a little blue box with 3 dots in it. And you click on that, and you can press rename, and you get to rename yourself. And in there, you want to select the breakout room that you want to join. So if you're interested in investments, put the number 1 in there. If you're interested in citizen participation, put number 2. So I'm going to change my own so that you can see what mine looks like. So I'm going to join breakout room 6. And so you'll see that my name now says 6-Tammy Mayer. That's what we'd like you to do, and we'll help you get into those breakout rooms.